On a salt-stiff night in a harbor town, Isadora, the mastiff who watched Rafael Moretti's lonely estate, howled for a litter that vanished without a trace. Across the quay, Maria Alvarez, a midwife with steady hands and a son who learned to read tides, closed her clinic unaware that this same night would demand the impossible. If you love stories about unlikely heroes, tap like now and stay with me. When grief drives Isadora into the storm, she follows a scent that leads to a baby in the river. An act that will set suspicion against mercy, wealth against dignity, and two guarded hearts on a collision course. Rafael Moretti's world smelled of brine and old timber, a thin, stubborn luxury passed down with the Moretti name. He moved through his estate like a man keeping time with ropes and beams, hands that fixed things nobody else noticed. He kept Isadora not as a pet but as a guardian, a heavy-muscled mastiff with mournful eyes and a patience the size of the sea. When she rested at the foot of his chair, the house felt less empty. When she prowled the cliffs at dawn, Rafael felt tethered to a life that still required him. Maria Alvarez knew other kinds of mornings. Her clinic was a single-room harbor house that smelled of chamomile and boiled linens. Women came with labor groans and hope. Fishermen brought scraped knees and quiet gratitude. Maria's hands were precise and fierce, calm when a head crowned, stern when someone tried to take advantage. She refused pity, and in a town that measured worth by coin, she had earned respect in small, stubborn increments. Her son Matteo watched nets and learned to hold his mother's fears so she could breathe. Elena Moretti kept the ledgers and the distance. She mistrusted emotion and admired control. Her loyalty to the name made her sharp with outsiders, and when trouble brushed the harbor, Elena's instincts were to protect the family footprint. On ordinary nights, the village's rhythms were small things. Lamps swung, gulls argued, fishermen mended lines. But not every night is ordinary. That same evening, while Rafael checked Isadora's pups and Maria patched a fevered child, the air changed. A collar missing from the nursery bin. A faint trace of frantic paw prints leading away from the estate. Dawn came with a hollow like the mouth of a bell. Isadora's litter was gone. Rumors began like loose thread, and by mid-morning the quay hummed with a single question. Who would take newborn puppies and why? Rafael arrived like a weather front, silent, tight-jawed, a dark coat pressed against the harbor wind. Word of the missing pups reached him before he climbed the quay. A collar found near the low row houses, paw prints leading away from the estate. He moved through the crowd with the economy of a man who had learned to hide larger pains beneath smaller indignities. When he stepped into the shelter, Isadora pressed herself against him and whined, a small animal grief that made his chin go hard. Maria met him at the doorway, sleeves rolled, a smear of herbal salve on one wrist. She stood square, not ready for apologies and not expecting them. Her clinic had taken in strays and litters for years. She knew the patterns of fear and of kindness. She had never stolen anything. The accusation landed like a stone anyway, public, heavy and quick to roll. You think I'd take another creature from him? She asked, voice steady but edged. She did not lower her eyes. Around them the town watched. Fishermen with salt on their caps, shopkeepers with towels still in their hands, neighbors who preferred quiet to quarrel. Matteo stepped forward, a teen whose jaw had learned to clamp against shame on his mother's behalf. Leave her alone, he said, and the word was a challenge. Rafael did not flare. He held himself as if measured words might bend a truth. A collar was found by the quay, he said. It matched Isadora's. There are prints to your door. He did not accuse with melodrama. He placed facts on the table like instruments. Fact felt like law to him. Clean, unfeeling, necessary. Maria's face hardened. Not from guilt but from indignation. You're telling my neighbors I'm a thief, she said. You want proof, Rafael? Check your servants. Check your boats. You don't have to look at me like I'm asking for a handout. The shelter tensed. Elena watched from the shadow of a post, ledger in hand, angles ready. The village murmured, how quickly suspicion found a home. Some nodded at Rafael's logic. Others remembered the kindnesses Maria had given them for years. Loyalties split in a town that survived on small mercies. Matteo's words caught, insulted, defiant. He stepped between them and the shelter doorway as if daring someone to put blame where it did not belong. Rafael looked at the boy, then at Maria. For a breath, Something like regret passed across his features. Then he folded himself back into control. He left with Isadora's leash clutched, walking away with the same measured silence he had arrived in. When he crossed the quay, the question hung heavier than gossip. Would he follow proof or his better judgment? The answer did not come that day. Only the hard fact that a fracture had been opened, and someone would have to decide whether to mend it. They turned their backs in 100 small ways. Shopkeepers crossed the street a little earlier. Women who once dropped bread now made excuses. Maria felt the town's glance like a cold wind. It cut deeper than any insult. She worked longer hours, mending a fevered child's blanket, sewing stitches with hands that refused to tremble. Mateo stayed up nights scouring alleys with a flashlight, following paw prints into the rows of fishing skiffs and abandoned breakwaters, every shadow a possible hope. He came back mud-coated and empty-handed, but with a stubborn set to his jaw that made Maria both proud and afraid. Rafael moved differently after the confrontation, slower, as if each step required permission. He watched Isadora sleep and felt the weight of absence in the dog's breath. The estate hummed with servants whispering about collars and prints. Rumor is a persistent tide even on well-kept docks. He had always solved problems with decisions and ledgers. This problem gnawed at him because it involved something he loved, and because the accusation had landed on a woman who lived by giving, not taking. The realization unsettled him in a way business never had. That evening, under the cover of dusk, a crate appeared on Maria's clinic stoop, sparse. Gauze, antiseptic, wrapped herbal packs, a small ledger of donated coins with one name crossed out, and another scrawled in rough script. Maria found it, and stood over the supplies like a person confronting charity she did not ask for. Pride made her turn the box once, then set it against the wall. Days later, when a fisherman staggered in with a deep gash from a snapped hook and the town's usual remedies failed, Maria pulled the donated gauze and herbs and worked by a single oil lamp. Her hands moved, precise and unflinching. The wound closed. The man slept with relief. She did not know who had left the crate. She only knew the work had to be done. Outside, weather reports murmured of a spring storm gathering strength over the bay, a line of dark that would not be ignored. The town readied shutters and ropes. Nobody yet understood that the coming storm would not only scour the shore but sweep into hearts, forcing choices that had been simmering for weeks. The sky broke like a thrown pan. Rain fell in sheets that turned streets to rivers and pulled the harbor scent sharp as salt and fear. Lanterns swung crazily. Tarps snapped. The sea rose its voice. The clinic's single lamp guttered as Maria labored over a woman whose labor had begun slow and heavy. There was no time to move to higher ground. The room filled with the sound of rain and a thin, stubborn chorus of prayers. Outside, the river that cut the quay swelled and swallowed the shoreline. The birthing shack shuddered as a wave hit the pilings. Wood gave a tired old groan. The floor heaved. In a single instant a plank snapped, and the mother's cry mixed with rushing water. A newborn, slick and gasping, was swept from a cradle placed too near the door. The blanket ballooned like a pale sail, and then tore free, carrying the baby into the current. Isadora's howl split the storm. She had been uneasy for days, nostril flaring, pacing the grounds, but grief sharpened everything now. She darted between ropes and pooled water with the single-purpose logic of an animal who will not let the world take what she loves. The mud sucked at her paws. The rain stung her eyes. She followed smell and sound, warmth, wet, the faint sweet of milk, until the river hummed like a new, cruel tide. Rafael saw her go. He didn't think, he reacted. He ran down the quay, sleeves soaked through, boots slipping on algae. The estate's lights blinked behind him like false stars. He reached the edge as Isadora nosed through driftwood and flotsam and then froze, snout under a broken crate, jaws clamped on a sodden scrap of blanket. She gripped and hauled. When she tugged free, a small shape came with it. A newborn wrapped in half a blanket, coughing and blue. Maria dove into the dark and cold without counting cost. Hands that had delivered dozens moved with the fierce economy of someone who knew which breath to give and when. Rafael grabbed the baby as Isadora pressed her body against the child, protecting warmth with the bulk of her chest. Water ran down Rafael's collar. Maria's fingers worked like prayer beads, patting and murmuring until the baby startled, then coughed, then wrenched in a tiny, fierce cry, the small, impossible sound of a life choosing itself. They lay on the quay, soaked and trembling, while the storm beat a tattoo on their backs. Mud clung to knees. Isadora's heavy panting slowed as she settled, as if she had spent everything and found it granted back. Rafael looked at Maria with rain on his lashes, and something larger than apology in his chest. Maria looked at him with the exhausted truth of someone who'd nearly watched a life slip away. Would you risk everything for a child you had never met? Tell me in the comments now. Because this moment will change everything that comes after. They thought the rescue would close the book. It only cracked it open. In the days after the storm, as the clinic dried and the harbor cleared of driftwood, small evidences began to surface. Details that did not fit a simple theft. A scrap of rope with a peculiar weave found caught in a boathouse ladder. A collar thread, hand-stitched in a pattern Rafael remembered from an old dockworker's coat. A smuggled crate note tucked into a ledger page at the estate, the ink smudged as if by a rain-streaked hand. Rafael read the clues like a map. Where others saw chaos, he traced pattern and intent. He sent Mateo with a list of questions and watched the boy return with a story about late-night loading at the old warehouse. Loads that weren't logged, men who kept their faces turned. Maria, still raw from accusation and rescue, stood side by side with Rafael more out of necessity than trust. They traded what they knew. Names from the docks, someone who'd lost more than a job, someone who kept a grudge like fuel. The man they uncovered was Tomas Rojas, once Rafael's foreman, a blunt, steady figure who had been let go when the estate tightened its sails. The firing had come during a season when the Moretti ships changed routes and livelihoods thinned. Tomas blamed Rafael for a slow erosion that had cost him family dinners, his son's schooling, his standing. He had not only sold puppies and falsified evidence, he had stitched a wound across the town to prove a point. That power could be returned with pain. But his anger is not empty. It is the echo of lost wages and a life rearranged. That bitter mirror made Rafael look at his own choices through a new lens. Maria felt it too. How blame and need braided together. The theft became less about greed and more about retribution, and in that twist their shared fight turned urgent. Exposing Tomas meant more than retrieving pups. It meant facing the consequences of a community divided. They thought the danger had passed. They were wrong. Tomas Rojas did not fold quietly. When exposure threatened him, he lashed out with a plan that was cruel and precise. Take what had been saved and hold it for ransom. One evening, under a slate sky, a shadowed figure slipped into the back of the clinic and tried to steal the baby who had been found at the river. The attempt failed because the town was not empty of courage. Mateo, standing watch by the door, grabbed a lantern and a length of rope and refused to let fear be the loudest voice. The chase moved like a jagged ribbon through the harbor. Running feet on slick planks, the scrape of boots in wet sand, the flare of a lantern swallowed by mist. Tomas ducked between stacked crates and up a narrow alley toward the cliffs. Mateo followed with more wrath than sense. Rafael followed after, heavy and deliberate, Isadora close beside him, teeth bared. Sheriff Joaquim cut across the pier with a pistol and a steady hand, voice cutting through the rain. Stop, or I'll shoot to disable. They cornered Tomas near the old boathouses where tide and timber created a dangerous labyrinth. Tomas shoved a crate and tried to sprint across rotten planks. A board gave. He fell, clutching at air, and the crate toppled, scattering fishing gear like a spill of salt. In the confusion, Tomas tried one last violent turn. Rafael lunged and struck him down. Hard, necessary, human. Mateo helped bind his hands. Isadora, moving between them, snapped and growled until she was struck by a thrown fist. A hot, blunt pain that bloodied her lip and made her stagger. For a second, terror was pure and fast. The dog collapsed, the baby began to cry, and the rain turned every sound into a drum. They captured Tomas. They also found crates filled with papers, ledgers of sales, names, payments. It was worse than theft. It was organized betrayal. The town wanted blood. The press could have come. Rafael's name sat at the center of it all, not because he had ordered harm but because his choices had left cracks someone could exploit. Maria, cold and shaking from the night's chaos, looked at Rafael with a raw question in her eyes. Can a man whose decisions cost people their work be trusted to protect them now? Rafael felt the old habit of hiding flare like a reflex. Then he did something he had not done in years, something public and costly. He stood at the quay where neighbors gathered and spoke not in ledgers but in plain voice. He promised to open his records, to fund restitution, and to place the clinic under a trust governed by the town, not his name. His chest was exposed to scorn. His power was on display. For Maria, the move was both a shock and a test. This was not charity given quietly. It was accountability offered loudly. They dragged Tomas into daylight, and with him came the ledger of lies, names, ledgers, crates, and the ugly proof that the thefts were an industry of bitterness. The town gathered not for spectacle, but for truth. Men and women read entries aloud. Some found their neighbors' names and cursed. Others, whose losses were small and private, wept. Puppies were accounted for in a dozen messy ways. Some rescued at the docks, some sold, some never found. The town mourned the missing as much as it celebrated the returned. Rafael did not hide behind lawyers. He walked the quay and opened the estate's books to faces who had once been only shadows on his balance sheets. He offered restitution and proposed a trust to run the clinic and the rescue. A structure that would be governed by a council of villagers, including Maria. It was not a congratulatory gesture. It was an admission that power unmoored can harm as surely as it can heal. Maria listened, hands folded, feeling pride rattle against prudence. Her acceptance would not be a surrender. She negotiated terms with a clear, steady voice. The clinic would remain independent. Rafael's funds would be conditional and audited. The rescue would prioritize community hires. The bargain was a covenant, not charity. When she nodded, it sealed something larger than a contract. It joined lives that until now had orbited each other warily. The final test came quietly. On a windbright morning, Rafael invited Maria to the restored lighthouse where he had spent years mending beams and ghosts. Isadora patted at their feet, a gray ribbon of scar along her lip. There, where the sea cut a perfect horizon, they spoke without flourish. Rafael admitted fear, of losing people he loved and of the consequences that came with the choices he had made. Maria admitted fear, of dependence and of being seen as someone to be fixed rather than partnered. They did not promise perfection. They promised presence. They promised to argue, to forgive, to keep one another honest. Mateo, standing nearby with pride softened into relief, clapped Rafael on the back. Elena, who had watched all this with a ledger of her own doubts, stepped forward and offered a hand where once she had reserved only glare. They married not with pomp but on a low pier, under a gull-scattered sky, with Isadora leading a small procession and the rescued puppies, some scuffed, some sleeping in new beds, dozing at the edge. The town watched two worlds stitch into one, imperfectly, bravely, with the steady work of trust. Years later the clinic hummed like a heart that had learned new rhythms. Children's cries, the soft patting of dogs, the clink of cups on a wooden counter. These were the small certainties that stitched the town back together. Isadora's scar had faded into a line that looked less like injury and more like a story. Mateo taught new apprentices to mend nets and coax frightened animals. Elena kept the books but smiled at the children who ran past her desk. Rafael and Maria argued over trivial things and made up with the same quickness. They built a home where decisions were shared and mistakes were owned. The truth settled in. Rescue is not a single heroic act, but a long habit of showing up. Love, in this place, was not a rescue fantasy but a practice, daily, stubborn, unglamorous, and fierce. If this tale warmed you, subscribe for more stories of second chances, and tell me below, who did you let in that changed your life?